Okay, man, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Now, come on, now crank this motherfucker up.
Break it down like this.
Hello, Internet. Gino, that Pinguino Greco here again with another episode of Deep Listens. And today we are discussing the fifth and final chapter of Kentucky Route Zero, which means there will be spoilers for all the previous parts because we're going to be discussing Kentucky Route Zero in its entirety. It's kind of hard to talk about the last chapter without referencing some of the stuff from the earlier chapters. So if you want to play this game, I would recommend doing so before listening to this podcast. And to join me to spoil this lovely game and discuss why it touched us so much, I'm joined as always by Pete Busby.
What's going on, everybody? Excited to talk about the last chapter. Like Gino said, I think this was a game that we all enjoyed for various reasons. And it is certainly worth the play. So like you said, give it a shout before you listen to this one. Fun fact for this week's podcast is about fruit flies.
Hell
So
yeah.
fruit flies, yeah, man, the best flies. Fruit flies are very well known as, having their role in drug treatment, scientific research, that sort of stuff. One of the reasons is because they have such a, quick lifespan. You can breed them very quickly. But another reason is that, let me find the exact statistic, fruit flies share up to 75% of human disease-causing gene homologs. So 75% of the genetic diseases you find in fruit flies have their equivalent. I was backwards there. Humans have their equivalent in fruit flies. There we go. And this is from Human Disease Models in Long Complicated Name for Fruit Flies and the Role of the Fly in Therapeutic Drug Discovery by Eric L. Barker. So another reason we use fruit flies is because they're really good at modeling people, weirdly enough.
Fitting. Very fitting. Horrifying, but fitting. We are also joined, as always, by M. Palladino. Hello.
Hello, everyone. I know more about fruit flies than I care to mention now. Thank you for telling me.
Oh, I thought for a second there you were going to say you knew even more about fruit flies. And I'm like,
no.
Oh, wow. Back-to-back fruit
I
fly.
know I took a forensics class. It comes up a lot, the lifespan of the fruit fly, because just forensic tracking is good for that.
So like you find a fruit fly in a crime scene and it's like, this body's fresh.
Yeah, it's like you can date bodies by like larva state and such. It's been a while since I took that class, but there's some more fun facts for you. Let's see. Last week we talked about romance in games, and then the night after we recorded, I actually got hired onto a game that is going to be talking about we're going to have a romance system, so now I have to solve the thing that I wasn't sure how to solve last time around.
Well, make sure that your employer doesn't listen to the podcast where you said you didn't know how to do that.
Yeah, I'm trying to fake my way through it as if I know what I'm going to do.
That's how you get through everything.
Yeah, it's going great so far.
Life is one big con. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for listening.
Yes. Before we get to Kentucky Route Zero, reminder, you can get in touch with the show at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comment sections and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out any number of ways. You can also support the show on patreon.com/deeplistens, and you can be on the Discord report.
The Discord report. Boop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop. This week on the Discord, we had a discussion about if you ever pre-order games.
I do not.
That I wanted to ask. Yeah. Pete, do you
I did when I was
games?
young and stupid. I don't anymore.
Same. I did, and then there was that phase, I would say, in the mid Xbox 360, PS3 era, when a dozen games had different pre-order bonuses at every single retailer. I think Mass Effect 2 was the big culprit of this. Like, you could get one set of armor if you pre-ordered at GameStop, one if you pre-ordered on Amazon, and it was just... it trivialized the pre-order to such a degree, and also it tried to incentivize you to do it so much that it turned me off to the practice entirely.
That's fair. ZP also mentioned Mass Effect 2 as the last time he pre-ordered something. I just feel like doing it through the online store is the way to do it now, because if you're going to be getting a game anyway, why not pre-order it and get the little ugly chocobo and the what is it? The
fucking
carbuncle that looks like
sin.
That looks like a Pomeranian with a gem on its head.
And
it's very ugly.
Fucked up
Final
head.
Fantasy VII's coming out. Did you know that?
Finally.
Have you heard? Have they? Has that come through your regular channels?
Weirdly enough, this show that occasionally does Final Fantasy coverage, only occasionally, we've heard of the remake.
Yeah. We're
Do people
planning
like
on
Final
something.
Fantasy VII? Is that like a popular game, or
Are you?
I don't know.
Is that a serious question, or are you being sarcastic?
I'm being sarcastic?
Okay, good.
Oh,
I know
Can
my
I-
Final Fantasy knowledge is limited, but not that limited.
can I complain about something that happened at work the other day?
You can always complain.
Oh man, I was at work and there was some kid who was helping me like stock products because he's, I guess, an employee of some sort. I don't know. But he looked at the Final Fantasy card game on the wall. He looked at it for a long time and then he turned to me and he was like, "Is Final Fantasy a video game?" And I was like, I didn't understand what he asked me. I was like, it's the video game. You've never heard of Final Fantasy? He's like, no, is it good? I'm like, how is this possible?
Were you just like, those characters in Kingdom Hearts that aren't Disney characters? That's Final Fantasy.
I didn't because I wasn't sure if he knew what, like, any game was.
Hey, you know those fairies from Kingdom Hearts 2, Unariku and Pain? Those are Final Fantasy characters, turns out.
Mm.
Yeah, man, wow,
It was incredible.
Was this person on the younger side?
He was probably like 17, 18. He was talking about his statistics class.
Okay.
That's like late high school.
Yeah, because I would say if you are that age, the last Final Fantasy game that came out was 15, which came out last year. And then the gap between 15, if you don't play MMOs, and 13, even 13.3 is like multiple years. Like the last
That's
real
fair.
proper Final Fantasy game that came out, like numbered one, other than 15, which 15 wasn't super huge, I don't think.
I don't think so.
It wasn't eclipsing. Like, I used to see ads for Final Fantasy games on, like, Comedy Central and stuff. Like, just during main primetime slots, I would see ads for 10, and to some extent 12, like on Adult Swim and stuff like that. But those games, it's been almost a decade since a good Final Fantasy came out. So I can't begrudge someone who was, like, 7 when 12 came out for not liking those games or not knowing about
that's
them.
fair. Just not knowing about them at all, though.
He wasn't alive when 10 came out.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah, that was the last good one. 12's fine, but like, he wasn't alive when the last good one came out. We're dying. We can't keep talking about this. I'm feeling sad. People on the
Turning
Discord,
to dust.
people on the Discord are also discussing Hotbird Summer. Please get the Twitter hashtag trending.
Hashtag Hotbird Summer.
Hashtag
All the
Hotbird
rage.
Summer. Speaking of Hotbird Summer, we did get some feedback about hot birds,
Yeah.
about fat birds. Hashtag Fatbird Summer. Sorry, I messed up my hashtag, messed up my branding. The fat birds, apparently, I've been told, are not fat. They merely ruffle their feathers to trap a layer of air between their feathers and their body so that they are warmed.
This sounds like something the birds would say. I don't trust it.
I don't either. You know, that's what I would say if I put on some weight. I'm
It's
not.
hashtag Fatbird Winter. We still fucked it up.
Damn it. Hashtag Fatbird Winter. Oh, man.
It doesn't flow well enough.
It flows just as well as Hot Girl Summer, Fatbird Winter. Get this hashtag trending. Apparently we know that that they are not actually. I've been told they aren't fat, but I believe that this is what the publicist for a bird would say. So I choose to reject it. I choose to believe that they are just, they're having a rough go of it. It's wintertime. They're not as active. There's all this popcorn. And they're just.
Sometimes you're a chonky boy. It's fine.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. They're little nuggets. They're pre-nuggets, actually. We also have an email. This comes in from ZP, and it says, ahoy hoy, Deep Listen's life partners. Just a quick note, once again, I've been exploring your older episodes and encountering a talking point that has a few updates worth mentioning. During a few Year 1 podcasts, Billy, Gino, and Pete bring up the now infamous marshmallow test when discussing video games and delayed gratification. At the time, the marshmallow test was still viewed as the doyen of early childhood and self-regulation. Nowadays, the Stanford marshmallow experiment is viewed with a lot more skepticism and not in an entirely flattering way. First, follow-up studies have overwhelmingly confirmed affluence, not willpower, seem to be what's behind some kids' capacity to delay gratification. That is to say, the rich and wealthy more often than not, do better than those classified as socioeconomically disadvantaged. Likewise, the original study did not control for children from a background in which the trust of adults was more common versus those who did not. Thus, whether or not the results show legitimate evidence of self-control versus distrust of adults is still up in the air. Finally, a significant conflict of interest was discovered in the study. The initial results were based on reviews that included fewer than 90 children, all enrolled in a preschool on Stanford's campus, the location of the lead researcher's alma mater. Furthermore, a new study in 2015 threw a lot of doubt into the authenticity of the marshmallow study. The new study finds limited support for the ideas that being able to delay gratification leads to better outcomes. Instead, it suggests that the capacity to hold out for a second marshmallow is shaped in large part by a child's social and economic background, and in turn, that background, not the ability to delay gratification, is what's behind the kid's long-term success. Finally, in 2019, a new study found that children were far more willing to delay eating their sweets if they were told it would benefit an unseen compatriot. In this case, both children were given a cookie. Each child was told if they could refrain from eating it, both they and their partner would get a second cookie. However, each child thought that their decision would not be affected by whatever their partner decided. In other words, they thought their partner depended on them, but they did not depend on their partner. In both groups, there were significantly more children who chose to delay gratification, thus cooperative environments could possibly negate the original study's findings. Also, trade rumors that the 76ers are going to get Buddy Hield for Al Horford make me want to die. That wouldn't happen until the end of the season, thankfully. And there are sources.
I was all prepared to be annoyed that ZP was fact-checking our back catalog, but that was an excellent update. Very grateful for that. I know a lot more about marshmallows in the study now. Thank you, ZP.
Yes, I think that that adds some added nuance. Turns out if the difference between what kids do is whether they have parents or authority figures who lie to them constantly instead of are these kids inherently selfish.
Yeah, weird. Who would have thought?
It reframes it. Okay.
Did something happen with the marshmallow study that it's now in vogue or something?
There has been a move in recent years that I've heard of to reproduce a bunch of the more foundational studies, because there were a bunch of studies that were just kind of taken as fact because they had conclusive findings, the p-values looked good, and peer reviewing and reproducing studies does not get you any gigantic shine in the way that producing studies does. But some researchers have gone back and tried to reproduce a bunch of landmark studies and found that they don't reproduce, which calls into question a lot of socio-political studies.
Yeah, it's also been bolstered a lot by recent big data initiatives. So a lot of people have built data scrapers that go through just massive amounts of studies and check the data for anomalies. So a lot of that recent stuff's been published to say this looks a little sketchy.
Gotcha. I asked because I was watching BoJack Horseman and Magic for Humans on Netflix.
Yep.
And they both do segments with the marshmallow study. So I wasn't sure if it it was in the public eye for some reason.
Not anything other than some recent reproductions. But also, I think
Gotcha.
for the Magic for Humans segment, it's just funny to have a magic man hiding marshmallows and producing marshmallows.
Yeah, that was cute. I like that show.
It is.
That's
It's a
my
solid
shout
show.
out. Yeah. Watch that show.
Speaking of things we like outside of games, it's time for my obsession. And this week, my obsession is the movie Big Fish by Tim Burton from 2003.
Oh, hell
man,
yeah. One of my favorite movies.
That movie made me cry in the theater.
That movie made me cry yesterday for a long time. So I think that it's actually an excellent companion piece to Kentucky Route Zero, so I thought I'd bring it up here. I had just seen it for the first time because my wife had been telling me for years, hey, we need to watch this movie, but it never had the right moment because it's 2 hours long, and she was always like, you're probably going to be sad. So maybe we should save it for a time when it's more where you're prepared to be sad. And it was the end of the day, and we had nothing else to do, so we decided to watch Big Fish. And it's a magical realist movie about a man who tells tall tales and his son who kind of comes to believe and comes to realize that many of the tall tales he heard growing up did not happen the way that his dad said. And so he starts to distrust everything that his dad ever told him because every way his dad tells stories is always in this heightened sense of reality. This, like I said, magical realist styling. And his dad is now on his deathbed, and he's trying to parse what is truth and what is fiction from his dad's life because he doesn't trust him. And so the movie jumps back and forth between his dad and other people telling stories about his dad's life, and then this main character trying to interact with the man who's sick in front of him. And I think that movie just has a lot of excellent moments of trying to parse the fiction in people's lives from reality and kind of heightening the life of this con man in the old-fashioned sense of the term, this confidence man. Just the little flourishes that he uses to embellish his own existence and where they butt up against reality it's interesting to see. And the movie does not ever really break down the veil entirely between what was truth and what was fiction, because there's more truth to it than you initially think. And so the movie does an excellent job, but there's one scene in particular that resonated with me for the purposes of Kentucky Route Zero. Do either of you remember the scene in Spectre, Alabama?
Yeah, where they go to the small town where no one wears shoes.
Yes. So the main character at one point decides he's walking with a giant, and he's going to the city. And they're walking along the road, and he said he heard about this shortcut that cuts through this forest. And if he goes there, it would be a little bit faster. And the giant says, no, it seems dangerous. You don't know where you're going. We'll get lost. I don't think we should go that way. And he says, okay, you take my pack, and I'll take the shortcut, and we'll meet up on the other side. And when he goes through this path, it's through this dark forest. There's no directions. He gets turned around. He gets attacked by sentient trees. There's a path covered in jumping spiders and quicksand and stuff. And after he gets through this incredibly dangerous path, he ends up in a town called Spectre. That's this idyllic 1950s town with no paved streets, just grass in between all these buildings, and one telephone line. I think it's a telephone line or electrical line with all of these shoes kind of tied on the top, like you'd see in a city, tied with their laces. And none of the people there wear shoes because once you come to Spectre, it's so idyllic and it's so perfect that no one ever leaves, so there's no point in having shoes.
Completely overlooking the long Southern tradition of hookworm, but whatever.
Yes, completely overlooking that. And it's basically this town, and once he gets there, the main character talks to everyone, and they're like, what is this town? How are people getting here? What's your deal? And they're like, oh, we don't have any roads to outside. Everyone comes here the same way you did, but this town's a little slice of heaven, we think. And so it's this town that's literally completely isolated from the rest of the world. You have to take this back path that no one knows about to get there. But once you get there, it's this weird, secluded oasis. They say, like, the weather never gets too hot. It never gets too humid. The wind blows through the trees, and it sounds like music. But later on in the movie, he decides he needs to leave because he could see himself becoming content there, and he's so ambitious that he doesn't want to settle down yet anywhere. And so he believes if he stays in this town too long, he'll basically get stuck there. And he comes back later on, and Spectre has a road created that goes to the town. And with the road comes a bunch of land speculators and bankers that run the town into the ground and cause it to become completely dilapidated. And he basically comes back and sees almost all the townsfolk driven to the point of bankruptcy, that all the grass is dead, all the storefronts are now failing, all because of credit and speculation. And so I thought that this was a pretty fitting little metaphor. I didn't expect Big Fish to have any sort of commentary on capitalism and its ravages, but it turns out it actually mirrors, I think, the final chapter of Kentucky Route Zero pretty well. So, Kentucky Route Zero, Chapter 5, let's get into it a little bit. It takes place in a very different location than all the previous chapters. At the end of Chapter 4, Conway, the character you're following through most of the game, gets picked up by some people from the distillery. He goes full skeleton and is gone. And the rest of the party decides to finish his delivery for him. But the game kind of ends at a stairwell going up. Did either of you play the final, the in-between chapter, the interstitial chapter between chapters 4 and 5, now that the full game is out?
Not. No.
I don't think so, actually.
Oh, okay. So it's called Un Pueblo de Nada, and it takes place in the public access TV station that the Consolidated Power Company runs during the night of the storm that decimates the town. So when you arrive at the beginning of Chapter 5, the town is flooded, and a bunch of buildings are knocked down. The interstitial chapter takes place during a news broadcast that is happening as that storm is happening. And it kind of sets up the town and some of the characters that you meet in it. So I recommend playing it. It definitely adds something narratively to connect chapters 4 and 5.
It's like 50 minutes long. Is it like an actual chapter?
It's kind of an actual chapter. You play as one of the people who works at the news station, kind of putting on a news broadcast, and it flows like many of the other parts of the game. Picking different dialogue options, commenting on the town and on the news station, and they're putting on like this ridiculous show, like you would expect out of this game. But it shows like the storm getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the news station breaking down. But you meet, some of the characters you're going to see in the final chapter. You meet Slow-Mo Crow.
Yes.
So you could find out what Slow-Mo Crow's deal is.
Why he's so slow-mo?
He runs the tapes in the station.
Gotcha.
That Crow's employed.
Good for him.
Yeah, it's hard in this economy. You gotta hire who you can.
I didn't even get the option to play this.
Really?
I wonder why that is. Yeah.
Did you play this on PC?
Yeah.
It auto-played for me after I finished Chapter 4 and tried to start Chapter 5. Or it settled in this... Maybe if you just jump straight to Chapter 5 and select it from the menu instead of selecting
yeah, I did do that.
the middle chapter. Yeah. Mine, when you're playing it, since they've released the full version, the game will kind of guide you to play the middle chapters.
Gotcha.
So this final town, Un Pueblo de Nada, is above ground for the first time. It's a town kind of completely isolated from the rest of the world. That the actually only way to get there is by air or by the Zero, which is the subterranean highway that we've been taking up until this point. There's this gigantic hole in the middle of town with a stairwell that kind of comes up out of the ground, and that's where your characters come in. But the whole town is kind of a big circle surrounding this one gigantic hole. So what did y'all think of the decision to have the final chapter of the game take place above ground?
I mean, it's hard to sort of answer without talking about the whole thing, but I found the whole ending sort of reactionary. So like in Marxist theory, there's this whole what's the word I want? Contradiction, this whole opposition between reactionary solutions and revolutionary ones. So reactionary ones try to rewind to the past, which is impossible, right? We can't go back to the way things were. Revolutionary ones try to use the conditions we have now to build on a future. So the example is, if we're in capitalism now and we want to change it, we can't go back to our small production past. We need to go forward to our group-owned communist future. And it seemed to me like they're trying to return to this sort of halcyon small-town life that doesn't exist anymore and can't ever exist again. And it seemed out of step with the more sort of prescient critique of the rest of the game, unless the point is that it's impossible, which it might be.
I think I would actually argue that is not what they are going for in the final chapter, or that's not the argument that's being made. So this above ground section, you can actually see the sun in this final section, and did you notice the subtle changes in lighting that I assume were supposed to mean cloud cover?
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty impressive for a game that's pretty much all dark up until this point. And you're not actually following the main characters anymore. You're following this cat that kind of runs around and sees all of these characters that you've met and some of the characters that just lived in Un Pueblo de Nada, just talking and trying to recover after this storm. You learn some of the town's history. You see little vignettes of the town getting created, and we'll go more into the vignettes a little bit later. But one of the frequent lines of discussion that come up in almost all of these interactions that you see is the idea of, should you stay or should you go? Will you stay or will you go from this place? And this town is populated largely by people who worked for the Consolidated Power Company. The town is pretty much propped up as a company town by the Consolidated Power Company. And now Consolidated Power is starting to pull money out. So the town is dying. And there's this tension that all of the characters have between trying to start a new life someplace else, giving up this town that they've spent time in, this place that they've invested in, or the new characters just debating between continuing on their existing journey or settling down. And I think that that's the tension that the game's getting at. Not necessarily going back to a past, but living in this abandoned, hollowing out place and deciding whether to move on or to try to cling. And that's the tension there.
Yeah, but I think you're just reiterating my tension in the same way, right? Like, I'm just saying there's nothing to cling to. They can stay and try all they want, but inevitably it's going to crash around them.
Mm.
But I would say that for a town, right, there's no what is the goal? Like, there's no forward momentum necessarily. Like, living a good, happy life is the end goal, right, of creating some sort of community like that. So stasis is not necessarily a fail case if people are enjoying themselves and there's generally satisfaction. The problem is that satisfaction is going away and all of the people are leaving. It seems like even the characters that have been screwed by the kind of capitalist runnings of the town and the lack of money are still somewhat satisfied staying because of their neighbors.
Yeah, I don't dispute that stasis can be positive in this case. What I'm saying is there's no stasis. Like, this small town is embroiled in all the sort of global capitalist systems, global modernist systems that we all are. And eventually these systems will come for their due.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely that's definitely what the game is getting at, setting it here. So would you think that's the main reason to set the final chapter in Un Pueblo de Nada, in this place. This is
Yeah, I
very
would say
different
so.
than all the previous spots.
It just seems weirdly hopeful to me, honestly.
Hmm.
At least for the people staying, it seems weirdly hopeful.
Do we know that anyone's staying?
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of discussion about a lot of the characters who we've been following, if they're gonna stay, but it sounds like everyone who's been in this town is like clearing out because this storm has just happened, and now, like, why are they staying here? Is the major question that everyone is asking. It's basically like an exodus, it seems. I don't know.
Yeah, and it seems like many of the people who live in this town are artists, combination of artists, poets. This game has a lot of artists, musicians, and poets doing menial work to make ends meet, or just kind of struggling, trying to produce their art. And it's interesting to see this town where that's heightened even further, as this literally, it's a town, it's a place of nowhere in Spanish, a place of nothing, a town of nothing, I should say.
I mean, interestingly enough, that's the Greek translation of utopia too. No place.
Huh.
Oh, really?
That's good to know.
Utopus, I guess.
Oh, okay. Right, it does. That makes sense. Yeah, so I think that having this place that a bunch of people seemingly have ended up in, trying to ply a trade to make themselves useful, but also trying to stay true to some artistic or authentic value. It's an interesting tension that's being shown in all these townspeople, and really it runs through the entire game.
Yeah, this sort of tension between art and economics is a real big theme for some of the Frankfurt School, like Adorno. I know I mention him a lot, but he's got his fingerprints all over this thing. So one of the things he talks about is basically if you want people to see your stuff, you can't abstract from the system. So like Junebug and Cricket, if they want people to see their stuff, they're sort of going to have to go through mass distribution channels. His other point is that if you abstract from the system, you can't speak about the system in your art anymore, which makes your art sort of irrelevant from a modern day standpoint. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's an interesting argument to make.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think that that's one of the central problems with many of the characters in Un Pueblo de Nada. They're artists making their art generally on a public access TV station that no one watches, and that only exists because of a settlement that the Consolidated Power Company had to make to do something somewhat productive. So they put on this TV show that no one watches with no budget just to kind of get ideas and get expression out there, but they're shouting into the void, which is depressing in a lot of ways, but it's cool to see these characters still trying to put something on anyway, despite its futility. So what do you make of the ghosts wandering around Un Pueblo de Nada? Because we've seen the afterlife depicted or melding with the living world in a lot of places in Kentucky Route Zero. We see in the mines the ghosts and shadows of mine workers who passed away in a flood. We see skeletons working endless machinery in the distillery in Chapter 3. And here we see a new form of what seems to be an afterlife. These ghostly, shadowy figures that wander the town of Un Pueblo de Nada that you can sometimes interact with your cat. You can see these stories from earlier in the town's history play out in front of you. And there are some ghosts that just seem to wander the streets endlessly.
Yeah, I think this fits in a lot of the stuff we're discussing here about sort of artists abstracting from the system. Like if we think about the difference between ghosts and skeletons in terms of a model of the afterlife, ghosts are entirely spiritual, whereas skeletons are entirely corporeal. So I mean, skeletons are sort of embodied labor, whereas ghosts would be the spiritual life. But the trade-off you make for that is you then lose any actual efficacy in the world. If you're a ghost, if you're a phantasm, you can't do anything. Not really, anyway. I mean, if we're playing by strict ghost rules.
Yeah.
So, I mean, your choice to be more spiritual comes at the expense of having any real impact.
It's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah,
It felt like the skeletons that we saw were so different from those wandering specters that were throughout the town. I didn't even really think of them on the same plane. Like, it seemed as though the skeletons that were working for the power company, those were like, still tied down because of their debt, because of all the things in their lives that kept them like under lock by the company that they work for. And then these guys are just sort of like, they wander past you. You can sometimes see like memories through them. They're like not bothering anybody. It's like ghosts in the truest sense of the word. They just do their own thing.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see also that the skeletons are kind of electric. They're somewhat technological. You can interact with them with a magnet to kind of cause them to reveal themselves. I think you use it. It's a degausser. You use it when you're interacting with Xanadu, and you use it when you're interacting with the skeletons. And the ghosts here seems to be made of something entirely different. They don't have that technological element overlaid on them. And I think that the ghosts here quite literally haunt this place and are mentioned by some of the other characters. It's unclear if the characters, again, are mentioning these ghosts as a metaphor, like the spirits that haunt this town, because it's an old town that has existed for many years, or if it's literally everyone can see the ghosts. But the ghosts seem to just give a sense of purpose and place to this otherwise failing town, where all of the skeletons are just kind of this alarming force that's consuming endlessly the people who fall within its grasp.
While we're on the subject of sort of skeletons plus technology, the final chapter makes it very obvious in ways I didn't really notice before that Cricket and Junebug aren't human.
Yeah.
They're automatons as well. Like, Cricket explicitly says he doesn't eat at some point.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure what to make of that, honestly. Like, why have them be, I don't know, cyborgs, androids, pick your thing.
Oh, so there's a scene in chapter 4 where they kind of can go into what their deal is a little bit.
What? I missed it? Where was this?
It was in one of the side chapters where you're on the river, the Echo River, and you pick one or the other.
Is it the convenience store?
I think it's the convenience store. Johnny can talk to people in the convenience store, and one of the dialogue options, he mentioned that Junebug and himself were automated workers. I believe they were created to work the mines after all the miners drowned.
Oh, shit.
Because they're machines, so they can work forever, and they're not going to drown because they're robots. And if they did, who cares? But they basically attained sentience and decided to leave.
I must have missed that somehow. I went in the convenience store too. But I mean, it makes sense. It fits with the automation, fixed capital replacing labor sort of stuff that was going on in like the Bat Sanctuary.
Yeah, and they basically just gained some personality of their own and then have been changing themselves, and they became singers. Which, if this game has a lot of people who are trapped in terrible labor situations deciding to try and opt out and become artists. Even fixed capital decides, what if instead we were singers?
Yeah,
Which
and good luck.
Kind of a beautiful thought, too, that these people who are being these robots, these cyborgs, they're still people, but decide that their purpose, the thing they were created to do, is not spiritually fulfilling, and so they need to go and make sad music. So once we get to Pueblo de Nada, we actually see 5 Dogwood Drive very early on. What did you think of 5 Dogwood Drive? The place we've been trying to get to this whole time.
Yeah. Well, we should probably describe it first, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
basically just a house frame. It's a pure white outline of a house with sort of a stage underneath it. That's about all it is, right?
It's a facade of a house. You've got 2 walls, a roof, no front wall, no back wall, and a stairway to get up into it. And that's it.
And a mailbox.
Yeah, it's got an address.
Yep. I mean, how else are you gonna pay off on everything this game is putting forward?
That's a good point.
If we actually found like some little old lady living in a house, like, oh, here's my pottery I ordered. I think this was the only way they could do it. And there's a scene where all of the characters that you've been following this whole game all go inside of this facade. They're like, this is actually a nice place. It's like the sense of opportunity and a thing to look forward to this represents. I liked it.
Yeah, it's kind of an open, hopeful concept of home.
Yeah.
It's a symbol of a home instead of an actual home. And you're basically taking a bunch of antiques from a failing antique store to fill this empty space. So what are these symbols doing for us here? We've got literally a symbol of a home. It's non-functional, and it's in this town that's dying. And we're filling it with old junk that no one wants anymore. For unclear reasons. So are we preserving something of an older society in this space?
I mean, there's layers to this. It's weird. Like, you want to say that they're delivering it here, but there's nowhere to deliver it to. So that fits in the sort of like utopian no place narrative we have going on. But like, it's like a halcyon sunset that they arrive at. Like, honestly, I'm not really sure how to unpack it. The game seems to want to make it positive, but not like too positive, which, I mean, fits.
Yeah, many of the characters seem to debate what should we do with this space because it's not a home. It's not there's no person signing up, signing to receive the goods. It's just an empty venue to kind of apply your own ideals upon. I think some of the characters talk about if it should be like a musical space, should someone live there, and you can kind of paint whatever vision you want onto it. Because many of the buildings in the town are dilapidated because they were poorly built by the Consolidated Power Company. But this one is surprisingly pristine in a way that none of the others are. It survived this gigantic storm that decimated almost every other building in town. So it seems like an idyllic space, but it has no function. It's purely symbolic in a lot of ways. There's a lot to unpack there. I think that maybe it is just a spot to preserve some dying idea of Americana. We're taking all of these old literal objects and filling it in this space, creating yet another museum to an old way of life that's dying. It's also a bit of a musical venue.
I think it's relevant too that it is just sort of like a house and a few people populating it. Like, as a solution, this is really only practical for individuals. Like, there can't be any sort of system level adoption of this. Move to a small town and unpack your antiques in a half a house.
Yeah. And I think that it also fits with one of the recurring lines that comes up in the game about Robert Frost's Death of the Hired Man. And it comes up at the end of the game in a scene that we'll discuss more in depth. But one of the characters during a funeral that's kind of towards the end of the chapter says that it's talking about the concept of home, the frost line is something we somehow haven't to deserve, and it's the idea that home is a place that it's something you get without needing to earn. And during a scene at the end of the game, one of the characters mentions that home is something that we somehow haven't to deserve. The line in Frost is something you somehow haven't to deserve. So it's expanding the concept of home, that each of us deserves a home, and that all of the characters in this game kind of want to have this place that they don't have to earn, they don't have to deserve. It's just a place that they go and can feel content and can feel supported. And I think Five Dogwood Drive kind of symbolizes that in a way. It's this open space, this roof in this failing town that seems solid, that seems stable, that at this point is now starting to get some of the furnishings that you would expect from a life or a form of life that no longer seems possible. And it can take in anyone. All of these kind of broken and disparate people feel comfortable under its roof. Which I think, at least that's what I got out of it. Does it seem reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a reasonable reading. I mean, perhaps, again, I just return to the fact that the home's hollowed out. It's like, I guess, what does it take to fit all these people under the roof? Like maybe you have to knock down the security and sort of separation of walls in order to do it, which might be good, but you're going to end up eating a lot of wind while you're at it.
Yeah, I can't. The facade might have survived the storm, but I can't imagine that anyone trying to live in that building when the storm happened was happy about it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's a building built to survive, but not to be of use, which is fitting for a lot of the things going on in this game, unfortunately. And that scene that I mentioned earlier comes at the very end of the game because one of the things that happens during the storm is two horses drown when one of the rivers near the town floods. And the game, during this final chapter, kind of shows the slow progress of time as you're wandering around with the cat. And you can see some of the townsfolk picking up these horses, like literally winching them out of the water and getting ready to bury them. You see some characters preparing poems for their memorial service. You see some people making art, like a mural, to kind of mark the grave in the barn where these horses are going to be buried. And all of the characters are kind of trying to get together and put together this funeral for these two horses called the Neighbors. One, do you think that it was a pun? They're
Yes.
neighbors.
Yep, entirely.
That's pretty good. I didn't think of that.
One, or is it a pun? Two, what do we make of the Neighbors? Because there's a bunch of... Did you find out where the Neighbors came from? Like where the horses came from?
Yeah, they
Actually,
were
a little bit.
they were there before the most recent people arrived, right? So apparently some settlers came up, I think from Mexico. Maybe they just
from
specified-
South America.
South America, yeah. I didn't know if they said a country or not. And they brought the horses with them. So that's why they didn't have names. They were there before the townsfolk. So they just called them the Neighbors.
Oh.
Yeah, and they basically were wild horses that would come and roam around the town and some of the clearings nearby because there's dense woods all around the town. There was nowhere for the horses to really go. And these horses just kind of lived in the barn near town, and no one really took care of them. They were the neighbors. And these are the last two of those wild horses that survived this long. And this storm finally wiped them out after years of, I assume, their herd thinning and thinning and thinning. And this is not the first horse that we see. The horses are a recurring theme in this game throughout. So we even mentioned it, I think, in the last podcast. We started Equus Oils. The very first scene of this game is a large horse built out of metal and oil. What do we do with the fact that this game ends with two horses dying?
I think it's just a a return to that idea of, a past economic model dying. Like horses themselves have become irrelevant as production systems, what Marx called them, not relations of production, means of production, I guess, as they changed. I think I might have said in the previous podcast that a lot of people argue that the introduction of the tractor was probably the greatest technological shift in American history. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't have the history to judge that.
You run those numbers before you mention them here.
But either way, right, the idea that these horses are dead, they're gone, they're irrelevant, fits in with this economic change narrative.
What do the horses represent in the past chapters? There was Equus Oils, there was the entrance to the Zero.
Mm-hmm.
Where else do we see them?
We see horses in the Zero. There's the horses.
Yeah.
So they're a marker on the highway. I think those are the main ones that I remember. And I think you can find a herd of horses as one of like little side things.
Yeah, you can see them. I don't think it was horse related, but what was the name of the bar? Does anyone remember? That Junebug and Cricket play at?
Oh, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I think it's like a Gateway to Hell sort of deal.
Yeah.
I was thinking Pirates or something, but it's not horse related, I think, regardless.
Or like the End of the Line or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I
the
took
lower
it.
depths.
Yep, lower depths.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of took the death of the neighbors as a death of this idea of the American frontier. This wide space to roam, finally kind of coming to the end as all this land is settled. Even this town, which does not have any roads in other than through the Zero, they basically subsist on, I believe it's trick pilots. Like pilots come in, there's a runway.
Much. What a weird, niche industry for this small town.
Yeah, there's a runway in, a runway out, and almost everything that comes to town flies in, or it comes up through the ground in the form of the Zero. And this town basically gets to subsist because there are enough pilots and enough people coming through that the fact that it's completely isolated isn't that huge of a deal. But now, if you're a town that doesn't have a road, there's no point anymore. The economy has become so based around the road, and even these small airlines barely operate anymore. So you can't subsist on these tiny planes. And even in a town like this, the town itself kind of symbolizes this frontier space that's closing off as people leave.
We mentioned the plane. You remember those guys with no shoes that were pushing a plane in episode 1?
Yes.
I think they were headed for this place too. Was that
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, do you think they were headed for anywhere? Really?
I mean, we see them on the Echo River. They could.
Do we?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we do.
They could be.
The planes are interesting because there's a whole sequence of what is his name? What's the kid's name?
Ezra,
and the guy who owns the plane fixing it up. Just an aside.
Yeah. The idea of sort of loss of frontier is another really big thing in American history. So after we achieved manifest destiny, one of the arguments was American democracy couldn't be sustained without a frontier. So that's when we sort of just being I guess we'll take the Philippines, and now we'll take Guam and American Samoa. And we just sort of started building our empire. But I mean, for various moral and political reasons, that was unfeasible. But America was very nervous about losing that frontier for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, up until that point, the only reason new states came into being was largely due to the frontier. The only division of states that's happened was because of the Civil War. Ever since the frontier closed, we've stopped adding states. And it's put the political system into stagnation in a lot of ways.
It also, I don't think it's relevant here necessarily, but it also got really tied up in masculinity. That our boys are getting soft without any wars to win and frontiers to conquer. But I mean, that's neither here nor there really for this game.
Yeah, that's a good thing to go die. Yeah, I think. But I think that the idea of this wild, untamed freedom dying is kind of sad in this town context. It's a small frontier town in a land that's completely gentrified around it. Because I don't think, like, the part of Kentucky we're in is not entirely rural. Like, at least based on the charts of the streets, it seems like you're near a city in some major parts of the game. So having this kind of isolated space. And this place also reminded me a lot of the town in the middle of the woods that you have to fly to with the gigantic Ezra's giant eagle brother.
Mm-hmm.
In that it's this space in the middle of the woods where people can go and they can sleep soundly because they're safe from the artificial nature of the Museum of Places. And so Un Pueblo de Nada is kind of a town that is permanently existing in the woods in a space like that. Did you also get that the town was built on mounds?
Mounds?
Burial mounds?
Oh, I did not get like
Oh.
burial mounds. I remember what was it, Rita? Who's the
Mhm.
person who builds the mounds? I remember her mentioning mounds, but I didn't get burial necessarily.
There
Yeah,
was a quote that she mentions in the last, like, when they're doing the funeral. It's like the whole country is built on burial grounds or something
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah, I do remember that, which, fair.
Mm.
Yeah, and in the southern U.S., I forget which Native American population it was that built gigantic mounds, but there were some large cities, Native American cities, that had these gigantic mounds of earth that were created, almost like South American pyramid style. And there are a bunch of digs. I remember watching a documentary on it, on mounds that have been uncovered, and the layers of goods that are kind of buried inside. Like, sometimes it's pottery with then layers of people buried underneath them, and then things stacked on top of one another. But all these buried goods once you crack into the mounds. So I think that's what they're referencing. This idea of kind of buried history, and also native peoples. In this case, the neighbors kind of coming up through South America via this group of people that wanted to come and create this town. I think they mentioned that it's like basically an expedition that's trying to find a new way of life that creates this town before the Consolidated Power Company gets there and commoditizes everything. And I feel like I should say this now. I just realized that the Consolidated Power Company, for as much as it is an electric company, it's also literally Consolidated Power. It's
Yeah,
the
that's
name is a metaphor.
Yeah, it's not like Consolidated Power Electric. It's just power. Brute fact.
Yeah, it starts as like, I think, the Electric Power Company, and then it eventually becomes just Consolidated Power, period. Which is pretty
Yeah.
cool.
I mean, I like the vision that the final scene presents. But I think it's worth noting that, like, this sort of rhetoric of return and, like, embracing a simpler past way of life is a lot of what fascism is built on.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that, like, one strong man can come up and, if we can just be on the nose about it, make America great again. Sort of return to this past that we can't ever reach again because things were better for typically the middle class and small business owner then. So, I mean, I'm not saying this game's supporting fascism. It's obviously not. But there is something dangerous about a vision like this, at least if implemented at scale.
Yeah, and I honestly think that the game, for as much hemming and hawing as many of the characters have about whether they should stay or whether they should go, no one wants to stay and leave the town the way it was. There are people who want to stay and remake it and change it into another place, into a place that's livable. And then there are people who think that the town itself and its very concept is out of date and out of step, and they should get out of there while they still have a life to lead. But no one wants to stay and says that the town is fine the way it is and doesn't need to change at all.
That's a good point.
We're literally burying, I think, the last vestiges of the past at the end of this game. And the only thing that's really up for debate is whether there's anything worth saving in this town or if it's completely worth abandoning. And that, I think, leads me to my final topic on this game. When the final burial happens, we have a poem that kind of sends the neighbors off, and you can decide how hopeful or what symbols you want to invoke in that final poem, which I think is a beautiful way to do the send-off. But then after all of the poetry and the dedication of a mural, and some like words from some of the townsfolk, we have a song called "I'm Going That Way" that's played, and it's a gospel song that talks about salvation and going on to heaven. And this game throughout invokes Christian music. There's a band that follows you around playing old gospel songs. Everywhere you go, you see them on the banjo and kind of in silhouette. And I don't think we've discussed very much what the Christian symbolism is doing in this game, because it doesn't discuss religion very overtly, but the ghosts of religion are following you everywhere. And I was just wondering, why do you think religion's so ever present in this game, specifically Christianity, and what's it doing?
So before, I would just like to make a small point about the music too.
Mm-hmm.
I think it fits in sort of a large tradition of protest songs and sort of, worker, like union songs, protest movements, social movements uniting around singing public songs, that sort of thing. Just as an aside, but we can turn to religious imagery now.
Yeah, it definitely fits in with those things. But in this game, it's used, gospel music I think is used in that format when we go to the church that's located in the giant storage containers underground. There we find a church that's very explicitly pro-labor, and it's being run by a janitor who just turns on audio tapes and stuff like that. So there we get very explicit combination of religion and pro-worker power. But some of the other spots where we see after we go to the Marquez farmhouse, there's a band playing. There's a band playing in the Hall of the Mountain King. Where are the other spots? I think we get someone at the end of Chapter 4, like towards the very end. And I remember there's a section on the side of the road you can find where there's a old church that's basically abandoned that you can enter, and then you'll find a tape of gospel songs playing, and you can turn the gospel songs off or leave them on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think, so I mean, the Bible's big enough and sprawling enough that you can use it to make almost any argument if you pick your citations, properly. But I do think there's a legitimate reading where, I don't even think this would be controversial, where Jesus is a socialist. Where you can definitely argue,
particularly.
I'm 100% confident their books exist with the title, Jesus was a capitalist, and something dumb after that. But I think it fits in with with sort of like a beatitude, blessed is the poor in spirit. Like it fits with a narrative of Christian charity that's woven throughout Christian history.
Yeah, and I think that the specific songs that are picked throughout the game, I'm Going That Way, some of the other ones that come up, Too Late to Love You. No, that's not. The World Is Not My Home is the one I was looking for. This World Is Not My Home. There's a lot of songs about the main character of the song struggling through a life of hardship, but at the end of the day there will be this land of peace and plenty where they'll either meet the people that they love or find a place where they can finally be at rest, and the world is good. That I think speaks to the struggle that all of the characters in this game are overcoming. The idea that even though the here and now is not what they want, the idea that there is a heaven to strive for and a heaven awaiting is really central when you're dealing with just difficult, hard times. We also, I think, get some of this in the mines as well, with the miners' music.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a similar danger here, though, that to suggest that, paradise is coming, it's in the future. It doesn't eliminate, but it mitigates the need to work in the here and now. to establish paradise if you think, oh, this world's just a shadow of what's to come.
Yeah, I just think that it's trying to evoke kind of the old slave spirituals, like the most oppressed folk
Yeah, sure.
singing the most deeply felt songs of the coming when the world will be made just. And that just echoing throughout Kentucky in this game, I think is very fitting, especially with the specific critiques of capitalism that this game is evoking over and over and over again. I think that it's a fitting milieu, setting this in Kentucky, setting it in these kind of downtrodden spaces that have been abandoned by modern capitalism, and using the kind of, I mean, Kentucky, I believe, would count as in the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
Using that vocabulary and that aesthetic to enhance the critique instead of shying away from it. Using this foundational element of Kentucky and not deciding that, hey, that's not what we're talking about. No, these two elements have to be in dialogue. I think it's really honoring the location. It's making the choice of locale resonant in all elements of the game. Yeah, so what did you think of the final scene? You know, we get the song, the neighbors are put in the ground. We get all of these ghosts of the town slowly filling in, slowly appearing as these two horses are put to rest. And once the song's over, we just see the camera pans up to these two horses in the ground, and we'll stay there as long as you want. And once you decide to move again, the camera will follow you. And I went to Five Dogwood Drive, and it looked like the characters were putting on a concert, and then the game just kind of ends.
Yeah.
It's a touching moment of solidarity. Like, it is beautiful in its way, but I keep returning to the fact that they're ghosts you're being, solidarious with. I mean, they fade eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
They fade, and at the end of the day, you're only left with death.
Yep. A fitting end for a Deep Listen's game, really.
Yeah. Did either of you play or listen to the chapter after Chapter 5?
There's a chapter after Chapter 5?
Gina's unlocking all this bonus content. I feel like they just sent it to
What the hell
him.
is all this?
There's bonus content between Chapter 5 and Chapter 1.
What? What
It's
is
called, It's called Death of the Hired Man.
it? Oh. I was wondering what the
Just to put it
payoff was.
Yeah.
Did you watch the play?
You don't watch the play. It takes
Okay.
place after the play. Caraway goes to the bar. What is it? The end of the line?
Just looked it
Something
up.
depths.
The lower depths.
The lower depths. He goes to the lower depths and he talks to the bartender there about his play, and they they shoot the shit for a while. A janitor who used to work for the bartender comes back, and the janitor says, I've got no place for this janitor anymore. And Caraway's like, give him a chance. He's got nowhere else to go. And so he's like, fine, you can come back. You can start working for me. I barely have enough money to pay myself, but fine. And he sends him into one of the bathrooms to clean it. And they talk about the play, and the play, at least when you do it at the Elkhorn Mines, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
He says that he spent a bunch of time trying to get the electricity wired up and the mics wired up, and that's a problem because it's an old abandoned mine. And then no one showed up because he didn't advertise it, and the actors didn't show up either.
Oh.
And like the entirety of the scene, you see the dialogue happening, and it just plays at its own pace. The only control you have is on a TV, and the only screen that you're seeing is this TV. So you can flip channels on the TV, and occasionally the characters will remark on whatever channel you're settled on. But the scene just keeps playing out at its own pace. And by the end of it, the bartender's like complaining about how his bar's not doing very well, and Caraway's just kind of being his open philosophical self. And it leads up to them basically reenacting the death of the hired man.
Mm-hmm.
And they mention the poem a few times, and the main the bartender's just like, "Oh, that sounds really smart, the thing you just said. Did you come up with that?" And he's like, "Nah, that's from Robert Frost, The Death of the Hired Man." But instead of so at the end of The Death of the Hired Man, they go to tell the hired man, hey, we don't need your help anymore. Sorry. And they find him dead because he's come back to this place more to die than to work. And in this little vignette, instead, we get the janitor asleep on a roll of toilet paper as a pillow. And the owner of the bar decides instead to just let him sleep and let him rest instead of kicking him out. So it's kind of a bit of a critique, or a bit of a change to the play, or to the poem that they are invoking. It's a softer, gentler retelling. I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop the entire time. I'm like, oh, fuck, they're going to go into that bathroom and he's going to be dead. It's called The Death of the Hired Man. They're just doing it. They're doing the thing. Fuck. Poor janitor. And then they come back and he's like, he's just asleep. I'll let him sleep it off. He's had a long, long life. But yeah, I recommend going back and seeing some of those interstitial chapters.
Yeah.
They're pretty cool.
I feel like I have to play the whole game again just to find all the stuff that I didn't find the first time.
Yeah, you could analyze this game for months and not find everything in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's very literally moments in this game where you cannot see everything in one playthrough. Many times the choices you make alter storylines, or alter at least your interpretation of story elements. It's unclear to me whether the story is impacted in a meaningful way in terms of the overall narrative structure, but it definitely changed my readings and my impressions, and there's some facts about characters that you know or don't know depending on what choices you make, which is interesting. So, are there any closing thoughts on Kentucky Route Zero? What did you think of the final chapter? Did you think it was a fitting end? Did you think it was a big... Because it was tonally, I think, a pretty big departure. There's no, series of chapters in this. It's just Section 1, Part 2, Part 3. I don't think they even say Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. It just says Part 1 for the entirety of this time.
Yeah, it's just one full scene. Huh. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, I thought it was a break, but good. I mean, I thought it was an interesting direction for the game to go in.
Yeah. I feel like if it was to end, if you were to go back to the power company and find Conway and do a whole rescue, that would have been, disingenuous to the reality of the situation. I think the only way for it to end would have been, something sort of hopeful, which is what we got. So I was happy with it.
Yeah, it was interesting to see that Conway's storyline, that's the end of him.
Yeah.
He gets pulled into the system. There's no going back to rescue him. The characters move on. They do his task for him, and they carry on his legacy. But Conway himself is gone. It's a shame. They do yet another reenactment of The Death of the Hired Man in this game that has 4 reenactments of it. So, Pete, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I think we've actually given a pretty expansive critique of this final chapter. Like I said, though, I mean, you could go back and play this game over and over and find new nuggets. If you want sort of an easy, I shouldn't say easy, if you want a less dense intro to sort of, Marxist philosophy and how he saw capitalism evolving, you could do worse than playing this game, honestly.
Yeah, I think that this game's incredibly dense. Its heart is always in the right place. And I don't know that I've played a narrative-driven game that does not overstay its welcome, or is the perfect, appropriate length as much as Kentucky Route Zero. It does not waste sentences. It does not waste locations. They clearly edited, and this game was almost 10 years in development, but the editorial choices, the decisions of what scenes to expand on, what locations were worth showing, where you should dwell, when you need a break, and how to make the world feel lived in and alive despite having in many cases, like really abstract symbols for where all the characters are, where you're going. Like there's entire sections where you're just a wheel moving around on a series of lines, and it felt like a place, despite the sparseness and the abstractness. So I think that this game's really a master course in using all the elements to their maximum ability, using the art design, the style, the music, the sound, and telling a really meaningful story that treats its readers and its audience as intelligent. It doesn't hold your hand. A lot of the symbols are overt, I think, but they are not so overt that they're pandering. And it actually led me to think, like, this game is, I think, benefiting a lot from the fact that many writers in games at this point from major sites are fairly left-leaning, at least at the sites that I read. So a lot of the symbols and the discussions that are being had in this game very much speak to that vocabulary. And if you're familiar with the concept, with Marxist concepts, this game resonates really well. Like, all of the elements of magical realism just become statements of text that you're familiar with. But I would wonder how this game would be read if you weren't versed in that scholarship. Like, would the magical realism just be completely farcical? Would it read cohesively? Because I know that when I've encountered magical realism or deeply symbolical work, when I did not understand the symbolism, or symbolic work, and I didn't understand the symbolism, it read as nonsense to me. The meaning was just, I couldn't tie things together. It seemed like completely disjointed things were happening over and over and over again. And if you don't have that framework to place everything in, I wonder if Kentucky Route Zero would fall prey to the same things.
I'm not sure. I mean, I am. You have to find somebody who isn't, I guess.
I know. That's the thing. Like, I remember I read some critiques from folks that I know who are just not quite as left-leaning, and who might not have done the same readings that I have. And they were like, I didn't really get what this game was going for. Like, what was this game trying to talk about? It seemed, needlessly verbose. It went nowhere. The characters don't seem to develop all that much. I don't understand the symbols. And it was a person who I knew who was not American and was not especially political that I know of, like not incredibly. And it just didn't work. And I wonder how much this game is really a beneficiary of how much the industry has changed in terms of its critical reception. Because I could imagine if this came out 10 years ago, a bunch of critiques about this game just being a game about smelling your own farts, just being very navel-gazy. The main narrative isn't going anywhere. A bunch of this stuff happens, but I don't understand why any of it's connected to each other. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Like, people were very into Braid a decade plus ago, and that game, I think, is very navel-gazy in a lot of the same ways, potentially. A lot of, overt symbolism in very similar ways. But I just wonder. I would love to see other interpretations of this game or other playthroughs of this game from people whose politics I do not know jive with this game so directly. And I wouldn't necessarily get that much out of the critique in terms of the cultural commentary, but just from purely grasping what the game's going for, if they would follow it, and how much it leans on existing symbolism. But that's just a thought. I don't know. And if anyone's read any critiques that are like that and wants to point them my way, feel free. At that Pinguino on Twitter, just show me. Because I really want to know. I've only ever read critiques of this game that were down with the concept and down with the politics. So with that, I think we've reached the end of Kentucky Route Zero. We found the end of the line. We've reached 5 Dogwood Drive. With that, it's time to pick another podcast game. And Em, it's your turn.
It's my turn. I think that we're going to play Dream Daddy.
Oh yeah.
Dream Daddy?
And now here's something completely unrelated.
Yeah. We talked about this on, was it on the romance? Yeah.
Yes.
I brought it up on the romance podcast. It is a game where you are a father and you are dating or befriending or having rivalries with other fathers.
You're a daddy who dates daddies.
Yeah. Not even necessarily romantically, but depending on who you're talking to. It's a good game. But
Let's do it.
it's definitely not Kentucky Route Zero.
And now something completely unrelated. I love it. We're a show that spans multitudes. Sometimes we play Silent Hill 4, The Room. Sometimes we play Kentucky Route Zero. Something for everyone. And so thank you, Pete.
Yep. Always a pleasure, especially when you get a game like this to talk about. It's always interesting.
Thank you, Em.
Thank you for finally allowing me to play this game and look at it seriously, because it's been on my radar since I was in school, and now finally it's wrapped. And
It's been in development since I was 5 years old, and finally it's out.
were you 5 years old when this?
No.
Okay.
I'm not 15.
I don't know when this game
I'm a
first
very old
came out.
15.
Yeah.
And thank you to our listeners. Reminder, you can get in touch with the show at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got comment sections, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can send in emails, and you can support the show. Patreon.com/deeplistens. Get in on the Discord. Join the discourse. #discourse. And we will see you next time when we play Dream Daddy. Till next time, peace!